Hi, everybody. So today I thought it would be nice for us to talk about whether or not we should homeschool our kids. This is increasingly a topic of concern for many parents, and there's a lot of kind of distrust increasing in public schools, a lot of political battles over this. But as parents, we want to kind of stay above that fray and just say, okay, what really is the best for my child? That's our main concern. It's not getting in the ideological weeds of things, even though it is interesting to understand what's happening in the schools. And that's part of our decision making, is to look at those things closely. But our main concern is what's best for my child. And that's not going to be the same for each of us. And so today I thought it would be helpful to just gather in some information for us. For those of us considering pulling our kids out, but we're not sure if we're capable, we're not sure why we would do it, and the downsides that may come if we pull them out, as well as the benefits. And so a few years ago, I became friends with a lady named Erin, and she's just really has impressed me through the years. She wrote a piece for us on the philosophy of motherhood that has helped many, many women, like thousands of women have read this piece. It's still my favorite on our site. And it's called, I really recommend you reading it. It's about her journey from, it's called How You May Have to Die, My Journey from Feminist to Feminine. And hopefully she can just touch on kind of that journey a little bit today, but she also is someone I've come to respect for being very deep thinking about things and considering all the, the reasons behind homeschooling, and she has decided to homeschool her kids. So just a little bio on Erin is that she's just a very curious and deep thinking person. She's interested in ideas, the natural world. She's a student of traditional culture, languages, science, human health, politics, plants, sheep, and mostly her own children. So she's worked in government, private industry, restaurants, farms, academia. She's educated, and she's now a small business owner that lives in Michigan, and she owns a farm and raises grass-fed meat. So she has 3 children that she educates at home on her farm, 7, 9, and 11. And so for me, I like to kind of, use the knowledge others have taken a lot of time to acquire. And I think Erin has done a lot of the work for us in researching these things and discovering what works. And maybe she can help us, because I personally am doing this kind of selfishly, because I personally am considering pulling a few of my kids out of public school. And I'm not quite sure if I have all the doubts that all mothers have when they're considering pulling their kids out. And so today we're just going to run through some questions and talk about some things and try and get behind, get underneath these questions to try and decide what's best. So I am going to bring Erin on. So Erin, do you mind just running through kind of your story of how you ended up where you are homeschooling in a farm in Michigan?
Sure. I'll try to keep it short. So I grew up in a small town in Oregon and attended public schools. And when I left there, I really had, not a lot of experience of the world. And so when I was in college, I would go for a few terms, and then I would save up my money, and then I would leave and travel, because I really felt like there was one type of learning happening in the institutional setting and another type where I was engaging with people and different cultures. I was doing a lot of international traveling and learning to speak Spanish, and was really just kind of pulled back and forth in this way, because I felt like I was almost like finally free to learn when I left public school. So maybe my own impetus from the looking at alternative to my children really comes from that feeling, is that I'm finally being let out of, I wouldn't call it prison, but I was being let out of an institution in which the prescriptions for learning for me were not fulfilling.
That's interesting, because I've met so many people that would use kind of prison terminology for school, and others who were like, it was great for me, like it was wonderful. And I mean, what do you think the difference is there? Why do some people do well in public school and others, it's just really hard for them?
So here's how I feel. Are any of your children exactly the same?
No.
Right?
Yeah.
So the system's going to work for the people who love academic learning, and they love sitting and receiving information, and they love repeating that information back and receiving praise for that. And that's fine, especially if you're looking into academia, because academia rewards you for producing the correct answers at this point. It isn't necessarily rewarding you for creative thinking. And there's obviously a vast portion of society that for which traditional schooling or academic schooling is not going to work.
Yep.
So in the way that you can see your children, they learned this way, and they learned the same thing in a completely different way. I just don't think that there's enough flexibility within that system to provide a really appropriate style of education for every child.
Yeah, the more I dig into this topic, the more complex it is. And a lot of times I think, oh, things are actually simpler than we think. But this is complex because not only are you dealing with different children and how they learn and how they thrive, but each school is different. Now, our schools here, I live near San Antonio, and we have great schools, like really wonderful schools. Now, I have cousins who live in Washington or near Chicago, and they don't, their schools are just, their kids aren't learning. Like,
yeah,
they have to supplement so much at home. And so it's not just when we're thinking about, am I going to homeschool my kid? We have to take into account the child and the situation that you're in, and your own life situation. Obviously, a lot of women have to work, right? Now, later, maybe we can get to how you get around those things. Are there ways to get around those things? But it's a complicated thing. And I think sometimes when I talk to homeschoolers and then I talk to public schoolers, they're so in their camps. They're so oh, public school is the greatest evil that's ever existed. Or, of course your kids are going to be weirdos, right? And so it's hard to really get an open-minded, wait, forget all that. What is best for my child? So hopefully in our discussion, we, as you guys are listening, you can just say, okay, let's try and think of my own individual case, and if this might be true for my child, if it might not. My oldest son is made for public school. He is a very task-oriented. He loves, getting the good grade. He's very into sports, so he loves all the sports. If I pulled him out, it would break him. He loves it. Okay. But a few of my other children, it really seems like you described your own experience, it seems like their learning only happens after school is over. And so I think it's interesting to consider the complexity of this situation.
I think it's fair to look at the weaknesses of both systems as well. Mm-hmm. Is that you really have to provide something that maybe also a community is required in order to really round those things out. So as a parent, you have limited resources, your education might be limited, and your time is, of course, limited. So a system or a community, if you have a great community and you have a great school where there's a lot of support and the parents are really engaged and the teachers are really engaged and there's a lot of funding, you're going to have a completely different outlook on public education. If you're coming from schools where communities are stressed and poverty is an issue, you're going to have a very different view of what those opportunities look like for your child. And also probably homeschooling would be a difficult thing to do if you're also trying to have, let's say, 2 wage earners or even a single parent who's trying to not only provide all of the financial and emotional support for their family, and then to tack on something like their education, I think that's a little bit more than some people can bear. So I think it's fair to break them both down and give yourself, and your family an assessment of what can you take on, what can be provided by the community, and does that look like it fits with the values that your household is trying to support.
Yes, I love that. And let's run through, we just have a few questions that I think will hit on some of these ideas and try and get them in our minds as we try and strike the right balance. Because there is a balance. There's like, the mother has a life, the children have a life, the father have a life, so we have to take all these things into account. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to, and I'm going to, at the philosophy of motherhood, I don't want to have any original ideas. If I have an original idea, it's probably a bad one. So I bring in things from old people smarter than me, back in, wiser men and women than me. And so I'm going to start with like a little quote, and then we can kind of discuss how this relates to our topic. So whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it is time to pause and reflect. That's Mark Twain. So everyone puts their kids in public school, right? Like this is just what people have done for ages and ages. Seems, it must be working, right? This is kind of, you don't want to be the weird one. This is a concern for many of us. It's like, wait, and I think for many cases, this is true. Like, okay, if things seem to be working, but how does this relate to public school? Like, who is it that should homeschool their kids? Because so few do. So maybe there's a reason. Like, what do you say about that?
Well, I could be accused of being a bit contrarian. So I really love this quote because even as a political person, I like the idea of shifting when things seem like they're getting a little bit crazy on one side. I like the idea of shifting and sort of creating balance with some things. So when I feel like the schools have become political, or when I feel like the schools have really pushed one type of knowledge more than a well-rounded education, or my view of what that might look like, then I feel like it's okay to step back and say, what the school's priorities are, do they match with my priorities for my children? And if not, can I supplement that? Or do I really need to prioritize my wishes for my children and their education over what the state or the school board has decided is the best outcome? I feel from my own perspective that the standards are not high enough. They're just not high enough for me. And if the state can do better than I can do, then I would reconsider that. But that's one perspective that I would probably add along with this quote, because I do love the idea of just turning things on their heads, and especially when everyone agrees, to me, that's a red flag. I've lived in areas where everyone agrees, and that really sets me on my seat, where I'm like, what's going on? Like, something's wrong here. Okay, if no one's going to point out anything, then I'm going to do it.
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely such a thing as groupthink, where we just kind of accept things as they are, because this is just what people do. But as you were talking about, the state and kind of the expectations, I think we need to realize that the government, particularly as it is now, what they are trying to do is reach the lowest common denominator. Okay, so the kids and there are many of them who have really hard home lives, who don't get help at home with their schoolwork, and so they're lowering standards. They're trying to equalize everything. Now, there are, we don't want those kids left behind. No. So you have sympathy for what they're trying to do. But as a mother, what do we care about? We care about our particular child. So there's a conflict kind of built in between the parent and the school system, because they are trying to do kind of, the public good, and we care about the individual good. And sometimes we can balance those okay, but it feels increasingly like that's getting out of balance. And so the individual child really is starting to suffer at the hands of, the minority. I mean, in certain school districts, it's not the minority, but in general, I think most parents do care about their children They do take care of their children. They do their best, rich or poor, no matter what. But it seems as if the school system assumes you are a bad parent. It just seems like, have you seen that? I don't know.
Yeah, I do. I think the state has a perspective that they know what's best and they're willing to provide that in. And my mom was a school nurse and she did a lot of home visits for families who were needy and a lot of visits for families who were lacking basic medical care or just basic hygiene skills. Like a lot of her experiences, I think, and people who work in social services and things are just that. They're not seeing the kids who are thriving because they're spending most of their time trying to make sure everyone gets the bare minimum. That's the argument of public health. That's the argument of social services, the argument, and that's the state's version. The church had a version of that too. And as that has sort of been marginalized with some things like charity hospitals and such, I really think that people who do work within the system feel like the system is holding up what's failing in the family. But then to take on every family as a failing family, I just don't think that need is there.
Right. And it lowers the expectations for every child. And so then they don't reach the heights that they could. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned public health. It's every time I remember when my kid when he was first born, my first child, and they were like, oh, let's give him a hepatitis B shot. I'm not trying to get in the vaccine debate. I'm not. But I was like, oh, wait, he was just like 1 day old, maybe less than that. And I was like, I was just asking the question, like I had no ideology behind this, but they obviously assumed I did. And I was like, oh, what is that for? And they said it was for like basically hepatitis is A or B. It's basically something you get in prison or like it's not something that my baby would be at risk for, right? And I just got sorry.
Most common transmission for Hep B that I understand is intravenous drug use and needle sharing.
Yeah, that's
2-day-old baby.
Right. And so I was just like, oh, wait, maybe we could wait on that. Like as a new mom, I'm like, I don't want my kid getting poked. But that's when I started to realize that it's like, wait, they have to assume like I'm a druggie, right? Like that they assume that. And so this is the conflict that we face as parents. And we have to be willing to stand up and say, wait, no, I'm the mother. And I believe this is what's best for my child, because we need a society full of mothers that do that, right?
Yeah, I think there are community arguments I think that are worth being made for, how people want their children raised in a specific area. And I do think it varies. I think the real issue is, we're talking about the CDC and the policy of hepatitis B shots because they would sometimes see people only at birth. They would only see you in the public health system that one time, and then you would disappear and you wouldn't necessarily go to a doctor or anything else. So it's their chance to,
they have good justified reasons for it. Absolutely. I'm not saying there's not a good reason. It's that the conflict, right?
Really good example of a top-down decision that isn't necessarily applicable for all participants.
Sure.
So as the school boards, so there used to be thousands and thousands of school boards. This is pre-1900. And so local school boards were basically a coalition of parents with the kids in a one-room school deciding what was going to happen in that space for their children. And if you have a coalition of 20 to 30 families, it's pretty easy to establish the goals and how they're going to be met. But when you have nationalization of school boards, and then you have politicization of those positions, and then you have the parents who feel like things are happening and they aren't necessarily involved, but when they find out, they feel like they have no power to even change that. I think what we're seeing is that the values of the state and the values of families don't always match up. And the values of the state feel like they are saying this is best for everybody. And the parents are, in my view, they're the subject area experts on their own children. So you can be an expert in health and human services, and you can know, you can have a PhD in education, but I know my child and I know my situation. And to me, these are not, they shouldn't be opposed. The reason they're opposed is because the values are different at this point.
Right. And like you say, it's just this huge, we've spread it from a small school
Right.
community to all of America. And so
That's why,
that's why people are like, let me homeschool. Like we don't match anymore. It's not working. But I want to keep moving on because I know busy moms can't take forever watching us, but I want to ask you, because this is, okay, let me start with a quote and then you must zealously guard. This is from Screw Tape Letters, where it's two demons talking to each other. Okay, so he's trying to explain how you kind of get people to the dark side kind of idea. Okay, you must zealously guard in his mind the curious assumption, my time is my own. The sense of ownership in general is always to be encouraged. The humans are always putting up claims to ownership, which sound equally funny in heaven and in hell, and we must keep them doing so. Screw Tape Letters. So this is a big one for me, Erin, where it's like when we have little kids and they take so much time, we love them, they're cute, it's awesome, but we have so little time. Once they start getting older and we're like, ooh, they're going to school, we start to guard our time jealously, like, no, I got my own time now. I don't want to give it up and have the kids home all day. I finally been able to write. I finally been able to read. This quote really struck me because I do this with time. Like, I'm like, it's mine, but it's not ours. Obviously, it's not my time. But how do you deal with this in homeschooling?
okay. So there's one of the questions you asked a little bit farther down is, I don't want to suffer all day. How do I manage having my children in my space? Because when they leave, the day is yours, so I have never had my kids in public school. The only time when I had like them in any kind of organized care was when they were really, really young and I was working full time. I had a very different perspective on all of this. So I was putting my kids sort of in an institutional daycare 3 days a week from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. And I would have all of that time. I would go to work, I would go have lunch, I would see my parents, I would just live as I lived before I had children. And I personally hit like this crossroads where when my third child was coming, the amount of money that I could earn at my job was the amount of money it would cost me to pay for having 3 children in daycare. So it was $1,000 per child per month at this institution in Portland, because we have to pay, it's because it's valuable labor. So we have to pay childcare workers to do a good job. So I reached a point where I was like, I just can't, this isn't a reasonable thing to do. But then I lost all my free time. And that was a major psychological shift for me as a person. It really solidified, this concept of like, either I am a separate adult or I am a mother and I function as an adult within that definition. And so for me, that transition was very painful. I did counseling and really had to work on kind of establishing what does an identity that doesn't involve a career look like? What does it mean to not have an adult conversation and talk about ideas every single day? I was in academia, and so I was just like, this is my bread and butter, and these are my people. And now I have these people, and they don't even make words yet. This is not fair. And so as the kids have gotten older, the project of being a parent is fascinating. And what happens is then you shift your focus into like, oh, they're doing this. And if you take that perspective of you get to choose, this is a Peterson quote, which I really love when you use the word suffering, because he's like, you don't get to choose not to suffer. You get to pick which kind of suffering or which kind of pain that you put yourself through. And I really, even though I don't want to call it necessarily universally difficult, there's a ton of pleasure involved with raising your own children. There's a ton of pride that comes with being like, I'm the one who taught them to read. I've taught them how to do this. They are super capable in the home because they're required to be home and to participate in that every single day. So it's just that constant Tetris game of like, how am I going to involve my children in this, keep them from fighting and get along with them, and still carve out like an hour, maybe a day to myself. It's not perfect and every family does things differently. But for me, it's the endless game. You're trying to shuffle all those things. But for me, it always felt harder to do the lunch packing and the time spent together between 6 and 9 p.m. than it did to say, we're all going to spend the evening together. We're going to wake up together. We're going to clean the kitchen together. And then we're going to sit down together at the table. It's worse for me to pack lunches, go and buy the food, the plastic bags, do those dishes, clean out the disgusting like lunch sacks, and give up all of that time in the evenings with my kids in order to maintain them leaving. It's just easier for me to do the dishes with them and to stay home and not get in the car and not sit in traffic. It's just, to me, it's like I've picked this form of suffering over that form because this one was preferable.
Yeah, I really like that. I think that's, as women, all people, it's not a woman thing. We just are like, okay, if I do this, then I won't have to suffer this way anymore. But you're right. You're picking up. I mean, I watch my husband get up at 5 a.m. and go to work every day. I'm like, that doesn't look fun either. So, yeah, he doesn't hear as much complaining and fighting during the day, but he does have his suffering. And so when we're homeschooling, we're saying, okay, we're choosing our suffering, but we're also choosing our joy. And I don't know. I mean, my husband loves his job, but I'm not sure how much joy compared to maybe when he comes home and plays with his kids, and so it's all about perspective and realizing that you're not going to get it all. And again, maybe that means, that's not to say you absolutely should homeschool. It's just realizing that, there's not one's all joy and one's all suffering. It's much more complicated than that. So
yeah, I think a lot of suffering is inherent in having children anyway, because you're all constantly checking in, like, am I doing enough? I handled this poorly. And then just that constant cycle of like knowing that you're failing and then also getting up and trying to figure out things better. And then your child changes and then you have to change. And to me, it's just a continuation of the thing that we did with them from birth, except to do all of it and I'm not handing it over. And that doesn't mean that it's wrong to do that or to choose not to do that. It's just that for me, it was preferable to be the one to continue this project with my kids. And it's such a short time that they're going to be living in my home with me. And I never wanted to look back and say, that went too fast and I don't feel like I know them. And I don't feel like I had those moments. Like, even when I leave, I have like a little part-time job and I leave one day a week to go. And they're like, why are you leaving the house? And I'm like, this is normal. You should get they're like, I love you, but I'm going to go do this on my own and I'm going to come back. And they're confused by that. And I'm like, okay, don't worry. It's going to be fine. And like, your dad leaves every day and this is a normal thing. But for them, I also feel like it's important, I do have my small business as well. And there are times during the year where I hardly see them at all. And like for my schedule, if they had been in public school, I would have not seen them during the day during public school. And then when my business started, my seasonal, nursery, I would start selling and be completely busy for the summer months when they were out of school. So there literally would have been an overlap of 1 month a year that we would have been not working and not in school together. And the trade-off was too great.
Yeah, it's like you have to look at your particular circumstances and say, listen, maybe public school doesn't work for our family. And you adapted to make it work. And later we're going to talk about, because not all of, money is an issue for all of us. And not being a full-time worker, that opens up problems. So we'll talk about that a little more. But when you're talking about love and suffering, I love the Dostoevsky quote, which is, let me find it. To love is to suffer, and there can be no love otherwise. Now, I think it's very true, but also the perspective we have on our suffering can take the sting away from it a little bit. Like, I really do think that's true. The patience we have. Like when you were describing those early years when your kids couldn't talk, oh, it just brought me back because those are the hard years where you're those young, when your kids are young, particularly for certain personality types. Like I feel like my sister just loves little kids and just feeds off that. I love little kids too, but that was a little harder for me not being able to talk to adults all day. And so we have to be patient with our suffering and say, we love this child, so we're going to pick this up now, but this isn't going to last forever, right?
Mm.
So okay, but I want to move on to, I feel like we kind of combine those, so that's good. So the next, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. And I have no clue how the heck I would be capable of homeschooling when,
Okay.
I mean, I feel like I'm kind of a smart person, but I mean, wow, it's overwhelming. So what do you do?
Okay, I have something I wanted to share because clearly I'm not the only homeschool person in the world. And I pulled this off the internet so that I could read it to you. This is a woman who I really have a ton of respect for. She's fearless. She's a homeschooler. And we don't have the same philosophy on homeschooling. We just have the same philosophy that homeschooling is part of what we have chosen. And I wanted to share this because what I would say, my answer would be join a bunch of forums for homeschoolers that follow different philosophies. So follow one that is Charlotte Mason, and follow one that is classical, and follow one that is whatever religion that is Catholic based or something along the other, or like whatever religion it is that you want to follow, and really look at what the different like possibilities are. And then notice the similarity among all of those homeschool forums that nobody has any idea. It's not that we have no idea what we're doing. We're all our children's educators. But one, we've convinced ourselves that we're not capable. And also we kind of aren't. Like, who's up to the task to raise a human being? And so I stole this for you and I wanted to read it and then we can chat about it. It's not something we know how to do. Not one of us knows how to homeschool a child when we start. It's like being a farmer and finding out you've inherited 100 acres in an undisclosed location, and you have 20 years to optimize output and utility while keeping the land healthy. And you aren't allowed to go there and walk the land for the first 7 years or so. You get as much information as you can, and you experiment and see what grows there. You test the soil, you try to get accurate information about rain and weather and winds and temperatures, but really the data is not that reliable. You start by sowing 1,000 different seeds in the dirt and finding what thrives. Keep track of what flourishes and what doesn't, planting more of the stuff that seems especially well suited for that dirt. That's all we're doing. And that's the quote. And I'm like, okay, it's a perfect metaphor because and truly every single child, you have to do that over again. So you have your 100 acres here and your 100 acres here. And I can tell you from farming for 5 years that it's so humbling and full of failure. You could pretty much say the same for raising children, is that you never become the expert of all children. You just do your best to become the expert of the ones that you're trying to nurture. And then you have multiples of them. So it's magnified even so. So you should feel inadequate to the task. I think that's normal and universal among all the homeschoolers I know. I mean, it's almost cliche because we're all like, today didn't really work. So we just stopped. So I've built in a few things in my own way of doing things that just try to, let's say, put the brakes on things before things derail really horribly. One is I never homeschool after a certain time of day, especially if a child is just really not getting something and I'm not communicating it or I'm not sure. I just say, oh, we're done. We're done for the day. My student to teacher ratio is 1 to 3. So no matter what the school is, if they can't reach my child, I can probably still within a couple days time circle back and help resolve whatever's going on. I also, when things like ideas or tasks get too hard for my kids, we back off. I always pull back on the academics and allow the child to grow into the space and then they can handle more. And so if there's behavioral things or pushback, it could be the curriculum, it could be their level of understanding, it could be your communication, but there's no reason to push. You have all this time.
Yeah.
You know, you've been given all of this. And the most important thing is to nurture the connection with your child and not what grade they get on their math paper today. So it's a long game, and a lot of days are filled with just like, you know what, where I get to the point where I know I'm going to start getting frustrated and not be my best. You know, moms have timeout spaces. So I just think we're done. It's fine. For older kids, they can read, they can go. And as soon, I mean, my other feeling is that it's really important to not just be an academically focused homeschool. We have a farm and we have access to woods, but a lot of times I'm like, you're done. You can teach yourself as well as I can. You can go observe outside. I don't need to tell you what to go touch and play with and smell and build. Like, you're free. You go do that too. So we can talk about this a little bit more, but that's probably what I want to say for that question.
And I've been thinking about this a lot as I'm considering what I'm going to do. And I think we idealize public school a little bit sometimes, even in our criticism of it. We kind of, I mean, teachers are great. Like,
teachers are great.
All props to teachers. Okay. But let's look at our own childhood. Okay. Let's be honest about our experience in public school. We had a few teachers who were really impactful to us, who really felt like they cared about us, they cared about us individually. Those teachers are burned in our memory. I would say my experience, most teachers were just kind of doing their job, doing what they were supposed to do. And I probably forgot most of what they taught. Then the last kind of teachers were bad. Like, they actually were harmful. Like, I had an English teacher in 5th grade that made me hate English for 10 years, And so I think we kind of feel like, oh, they know how to do it. But when we actually consider there are a lot of great teachers, but there's also a lot that aren't that great, and they have to teach a class of 30 kids, and they have to go the lowest common denominator too. And they're doing lots of worksheets. And so I just, at first I was like, well, how can I do everything they do? And then when I have my kids explain what they do in a day, I think, man, I could do that in 10 minutes. But I think what I keep thinking is I get to pick that I'm going to be that impactful teacher, right? Unless I'm willing to say I'm going to be that first kind of teacher that actually really made me retain knowledge, I should not be homeschooling, in my opinion, right? Like, and so if you're going in, you got to go in all the way with the belief that you can be that. And it's interesting when you remember those teachers, there wasn't anything really that special about them, except they actually really cared, they actually wanted you to learn and be curious, and these are things a mother with a love for a child is going to come a lot more naturally. And so, while we see the flaws in public school, we need to be honest about our own capability with public school, like compared to public school, because the bar isn't as high as we might think.
I think we've siloed the idea of education to look like something very specific, but we're always our children's first teachers, and we do everything we can. We buy all the toys and the educational things. And I always tell people, like, okay, look, I know you don't feel capable of homeschooling, so I want to know what resources you and what experts you consulted when you taught your child to speak, because teaching your child to speak is a huge milestone. Did you ask anybody how to do it? Did you read a book on it? Did you call anyone or talk to anyone? I mean, unless your child had significant delays or there was some reason why you needed to, most people it's like the assumption is it's going to happen and somehow we make it happen, and there's mystery, but their brains are wired for it. I mean, they're the ones who are really, like, at that point, children's brains are focused on language acquisition, and that changes over time. But the truth is that within a family with basically zero extra attempts, like, we all managed to do this well.
Yeah, it's true. We put too much pressure on ourselves, and we put a time limit on things when each kid needs to do something. And I think that's what I've noticed with kids who are kind of traumatized by public school, is that kind of clock that they feel in the background. Like, I'm not getting reading, not getting it, and I'm supposed to by now. And I mean, I have siblings who had that, who, luckily my mom was like not the kind to be like, oh, you need to, freak out like so many of us do. And they're, they turn out to be really intelligent adults, but because they're in a system where it's, it's filled, it's kind of a sterile, just you got to meet this criteria. It can be damaging to kids, like long-term psychology, and their view of themselves.
Especially their view of their own mental capacity. So something like learning how to read, there's a window that's prescribed that your child should be reading at this level by this age. I personally am a little bit abhorred by the reading levels of graduates after 12 years of school. And to me, that's an indictment of the public school system. When I think at the same time, they also stigmatize children who do have delays in learning to read. And I don't remember where I found this, but I remember reading in a book on parenting or on homeschool. I can't remember where I found it, but the spectrum of learning to read is anywhere between like 4 and 11, which sounds completely unacceptable. And you wouldn't even know what to do with a kid in public school who was 11 but couldn't read. However, if that's a spectrum, and even if it's an outlier, can you imagine what an 11-year-old would feel like in a public school who can't read? Like, just the amount of I know that feeling because I had it with math. Yeah. It wasn't my subject. And when I didn't, I just stopped doing it entirely and I still don't feel incapable of doing it, but the way I felt at the time just made it so I never felt confident in school doing it ever again.
I mean, there's rabbit holes we could go down with this. Just, wiggly boys sitting for 7 hours a day. I mean, is it 1 to 5 that are now on ADHD medication? And mostly due to the recommendations of teachers because they can't sit still in a classroom. Now, I'm not saying that there's not ever, obviously ADHD is real and some kids need it, but I don't think anyone is out. It's way overprescribed. And this is a dangerous and medication for young brains. And it's just another instance of this trying to fit us into a public school shaped box. But it can be overwhelming for parents because I know so many who are really disturbed by these kind of things, but their life situation makes it seem like they can't do it. So I want to move to that.
Hey, one thing about ADHD, especially if you have a child that you think you might want to homeschool who has been diagnosed or has been prescribed medication for this, there is research, and I can find it, maybe I can fit it into the essay that I was going to give you on this topic, but kids who had 90 minutes of vigorous exercise before they began their schooling the day, the kids who were diagnosed as ADHD had none of the symptoms of it. So if you're considering homeschooling in a highly physically active child, give them an hour and a half to 2 hours of vigorous outside play before you start any kind of schooling, and then see how it goes, and give yourself the grace to maybe there is an issue and that's okay, but maybe it's just that your school day needs to be flipped. In our homeschool co-op, I often will take videos from my husband of the boys in the same classroom, a picture of the boys and what they're doing and a picture of the girls and what they're doing, just to show him, like, our kids normal, and here's what normal boys look like in a classroom, and here's what the girls are doing. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with either group, but the way that they interact and behave is fascinating and quite different.
Oh yeah, it really is. I mean, and of course there's outliers. There's, like, as Jordan Peterson says, we're more similar than we are different gender-wise. Right, but it definitely seems like it's particularly around 4th, 5th grade, we start to really see a difference occurring between boys and girls and how they learn, how they interact socially with each other, and what they need from a school system. And I'm just very disturbed by it's in one of my kids' schools. They had this, it was like Good Citizenship Award that they would give to, I think it was like 1st grade. And it was kind of a big deal. And every single month they would give it to a girl. It was always a girl. Okay. And it was just like, if you have to be a girl to get this award, maybe you need to change the definition of a good citizen, because I'm sorry, it's just like,
It's just a behavior award.
yeah.
Literally just for behavior, which girls are great at.
So yeah, Plato anyway, supposedly said this. I still don't believe it's really him, but because it doesn't sound like something he'd say. But you know, I hope he said this. Give me a different set of mothers, and I will give you a different world. Now, I think he actually wanted philosophers to raise children, but I agree with this statement. If you give me a different set of mothers, we'll have a different world. And so when we're looking at like whether or not to homeschool our kids, there's a lot now about how schools are indoctrinating our children, brainwashing our children in a certain, you know, ideology or political way.
Right.
And I've heard this argument from many people, and I would just want to hear what you have to say about it, which is, well, if you take your kids out of school, then aren't you just the one indoctrinating them? What do you say?
Okay, so I love that you asked me about the word indoctrination, because I've been asked this question. In fact, when we started attending church, one of my family members said, aren't you worried that you're indoctrinating your children? And I was like, I'm not sure that I would say that to like someone who brought up their child in the culture in which they were raised. And so I just don't know that I would agree that all indoctrination is propaganda. So I went and looked up, like, what's the basic definition? There's actually 2, and they both really work. So the first one is to instruct in a body of principles. Like, am I going to indoctrinate my children? Am I going to instruct them in a body of principles? Yes. Am I going to propagandize my children? I mean, probably to some degree, because I am giving them that. But my first goal is not an ideological one. But if the state's goal is opposed to my goals, that's where I feel like we have this feeling where you're the propagandist. No, you're the propagandist. If the school's values are aligned with the parents, then we don't need to have this conversation. It's when the two are at odds. So I feel the right to remove my child from systems of ideological propaganda if I feel they're being exposed to it. Do I feel like I'm capable of exposing my children to ideological propaganda? Probably. Is that in my best interest, or in my original feelings about it being a parent, that most parents are just raising partisans? No. I think that they're more concerned with the principles and the values that they impart to their children, and not so much who they're going to vote for in the future. I think the state has much more interest in producing partisans and ideologues than it does in producing people of value who might oppose them. So
I like that. And I think, I mean, if you look at like Aristotle and Plato, who we used to kind of base education on, like educating children was educating them in values. That's what it was. Right. You educate them in virtue. Aristotle said the best way to teach morality is to make it a habit with children. And so part of the education system was supposed to be to teach morality to children. Now, I don't think many of us could claim that the public school system is even trying to really do that anymore. Like, they don't teach manners or what?
I think that the school system absolutely has a body of values that they are trying to impart on children. I just don't think that they align with all of what parents want.
Yes, I think they're trying to impart kind of a worldview, you would say, right? A worldview. But I think what Plato and Aristotle were trying to say is this, you know, what C.S. Lewis would call the moral law, this law of justice, of, you know, the virtues that undergird our society, that we're supposed to, even how to treat your elders. These traditions that are just scorned now. It's like, no, we don't respect our elders. They have to earn our respect. And it's just, the problem is that parents want their kids to have these virtues. They know that that's part of their job, is to pass their moral values onto their children. But when they send them to school, it's like almost like they're trying to undo what they've taught at home. And I think, like, I'm a Christian, and I just think, you know what? I believe that I'm right. I think that my worldview is right. And I had these children, and they don't belong to me, but I am supposed to take care for them. I think, as you know, do we believe that our children are meant to be protected by us or some sterile other entity that's out there? So we just have to consider this. And like I said, not all schools are the same. Like, there are some school districts where, my school district, I feel pretty safe sending my kids there. I feel like the teachers are good and they're not trying to undermine what I'm teaching at home. But that's not true for every school district. And I think it's actually really important that we consider this, because you're seeing children depart from the values of their parents very quickly now. I mean, have you seen this, Erin, where it's almost like they don't agree on anything? Your teenager and your parent, there's just no commonality anymore.
Okay, so I read a book when my kids were still very little called Hold On to Your Kids. And I would really recommend this book. And it literally just talks about the value of attachment within the family structure, like literally the amount of hours you spend together versus your child being in school, and how stable those relationships are versus the instability of the social relationships that children have with each other in a public school setting. I know there
and add to that, cell phone usage, all the messages they're getting there. Another book I recommend people read is called The Collapse of Parenting by Leonard Sachs. He talks about all these issues, and it's excellent. But okay, so let's move on to, well, we've kind of already talked about what the individuality of each child. And the quote here is by Robert John Meehan, and it says, "Every child has a different learning style and pace. Each child is unique, not only capable of learning, but also capable of succeeding." And so, is homeschooling always better? And perhaps some children need public school. So we've talked about this a little bit, just looking at each child, but do you ever feel like there's a case in which you've seen, oh, that kid should not be homeschooled?
Yeah, I think so. And honestly, it probably had a lot more to do with the family structure and support for that than necessarily the child. But I have even my own child, he's hyper social and he loves being with his peers. And a lot of the conversations that we've had around whether he went to school or not was not only that he needed that like he needs that social time, and he's constantly negotiating for extra social time and such, and that he could benefit from having teachers who were not me. It isn't that I couldn't provide him with a piano teacher and a Latin instructor out of my own pocket and with my own time, but those relationships that he could form with instructors were also like possibly beneficial, especially if they were male, because our homeschooling co-op is entirely moms. The other piece missing from that is male role models in an instructional setting. And I just feel like there are times for sure when public school, the other thing I think is that public school can provide, like you said, it provides for the means, but what it could do is actually provide for the very gifted and the very differently abled, or someone who needed special needs. Instead of taking the public school mean and saying we're teaching to this, you could say these kids require extra that maybe a home setting cannot provide. And these kids require extra that maybe the home setting cannot provide, or the family is too taxed. Like, I think public school is certainly, it could be of public benefit. It was clearly seen as such in history because compulsory schooling for children was considered part of the advancement of the nation. And it became sort of a national project to instill and making sure children got at least a minimum of, let's say, a 5th or 6th grade education. However, I don't think what it's doing right now is necessarily what it could be doing. And so you have parents who either for financial or personal reasons, otherwise, like, need their children to be in school, that's fine. But I also think the school should have even like a smaller number of children personally to be able to focus on the kids who are really gifted and need a lot of extra, not pressure, but support to be able to advance. And then parents who, let's say they, like my mom was a school nurse and she did a lot of work with children who were highly special needs. And those parents sometimes also need that support to either to go and work or to be able to have their child even interact with other people at all. If someone's in home care, I think it's a really important thing that they get out and socialize. But I don't see public school as like meeting the needs of parents. I see public school saying, here is what we're going to provide, and you're going to conform to what we think is best. And to me, I would turn it on its head and say, we're here to provide the exceptional services, not the mean.
Well, and I agree. I think I have a little bit of hope that maybe because more and more parents are pulling their kids out of school. Like I just read an article at Salt Lake City, they've had to, fire a bunch of teachers because so many have pulled out. So maybe they are going to see that they're going to have to adapt. I don't have a ton of hope for that, but like, yeah, the other thing I've considered is that with public school, and this is something homeschool parents might want to remember, is that it actually adds hardship to kids' lives. And you think, well, why would I want that? I don't want bad teachers for my kids. But we need our kids to have some hardship. We need them to have a bad teacher or, a bad experience, or to do things they don't want to do, get up early when they don't want to. I think that this can get extreme. And in the case of public school, I think it has, where it's like there's way too much bad, not enough good in some cases, in some schools, not in all. And so you have to have the balance. But I think I have known some homeschool moms who it's like their kids aren't toughening up as much because they're not being challenged with doing things they don't want to do. And it's like we've talked about, where it's like, well, they're not ready to read, so let's push it back. I think that's true. But what if you're pushing it back too far? You have to stay in that zone of optimal, whatever it's called, optimal learning zone. And so if we're gonna homeschool our kids, we have to remember to add hardship to our kids' lives, which sounds so bad to say. But and I just, Erin, from what I've heard of you, you do that through the farm, like your farming business. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's not necessarily the business because they're not really quite old enough to interact in like a retail setting. My son will run carts for, customers sometimes, but truly, so this is my answer to this. You can't be the devouring mother. You cannot homeschool your children, protect them forever, protect them from hardship, and say that what you want for them is a great future. So you have to confront that part of yourself as well, where you really want to protect them, which was never my interest personally in homeschooling. My interest was keeping them out of the public school system because I had feelings about the system and how it is originally constructed. And that's another conversation. But in my home, I'm like, there is no lack of hardship. I'm like, I'm not trying to be mean. I love my kids. I want to be with them, but they're not getting out of anything. They can't say, well, I have to go to school now, so I don't have to make my bed. They have a set of chores in the morning that before 9 a.m. have to be completed, including making their breakfast, doing their dishes, cleaning their room, getting themselves personally. There's no pajamas. Like, this is just how I run, because I know if I don't provide a structure, They may not self-impose it. I have some child,
All right, so if I homeschool, I'm gonna have to do all those things. I'm gonna have to get up before 9. No, I'm just joking.
No, but so there have to be natural consequences for things. So if you can't get up and homeschool by 9, then your bedtime shifts forward an hour.
Yeah.
So if you have those things and you're not ready to go at 9, the consequence is there. It's not that it's not necessarily painful, but there's just built into that day, and everyone has, I would say, more than the average child amount of chores. But one of the reasons why they do that is because, to me, the job of educating a child is also teaching them to cook, teaching them how to do the laundry, teaching them how to maintain a home, teaching them about money. And so when they're little and the house chores are here, one, it can either be when they're fighting, it can be a reward for that. So if they cannot get along with each other, I'm like, great. If you're so bored that you have to fight with each other, I have a whole list of chores here. Just pick one, and then we come back when you're done with that chore. You know, I can come up with a million things for them to do during the day if they're bored or if they're not motivated. And so maybe that's manipulation to parents, but in my view, I'm not trying to produce children who cannot handle the necessities of life. I'm trying the opposite. So I want them to be completely capable of running this house without me. But what if I'm not here? I don't want my husband to say, okay, well, you're not capable, so I need to put you in public school or do these other things. If I'm not here and I'm not able to continue educating my children any longer, I want them to be as capable at the youngest age possible in not just academia, but in real world skills. So yeah, they milk the goats sometimes, they weed the garden sometimes. My 11-year-old feeds the wood burner and keeps our house warm. They're just non-negotiable. So he does stuff he doesn't like every day. He's also like a lovely laid back kid and would not do any of it if we didn't impose it. Yeah. Whereas other kids who are going to overimpose it on themselves. So I try to be more lax and say, you know what, you've already made the lunches for everybody and you've already cleaned your room and you've already put away your laundry. Why don't you sit and enjoy a book? Why don't you just go do something that you like? So it's different child to child as well.
It's a balance. I think it's always just keeping in your mind what's best for the child. You know, I think that really is it, right? Because sometimes it can feel so overwhelming, like like the balance that you have to strike. But it's just being in tune with where, like, okay, do I need to be harsher? Do I need to be less harsh? Where do I need to be with this child? And that's something that, you know, the public school system is not going to adapt to the child that way. They're not capable of doing that.
Because in the interest of fairness, they have to apply the rule fairly.
Right.
You know, I understand that, but that's not really how I see parenting. Applying a rule across the board to all my children wouldn't necessarily produce the same outcome, and they wouldn't necessarily see it as fair.
Yes, you know, exactly. Well, I want to kind of close with this because I think it's important, which is the practical, what it actually means to homeschool a child. Now, when I was looking into homeschooling, I'm still trying, like, I think I'm going to pull my kids out in March, a few of them, not all of them. See, I have a special needs daughter who has a speech disorder. And so like you were saying, there's services in the school that she gets. And so I'm going to leave her. And then my oldest, who is the athlete, I'm going to leave him. But these middle children, I'm considering pulling out. But I'm actually amazed by the options out there. Okay, so we say, are you going to homeschool your kids? But there's a lot of in between, like this, where we live, that we have 3 schools nearby that are university model. Have you heard of this university model education, where they go to a private school 2 days a week, and then, and I think middle school, they do 3 days a week. And then you supplement at home, and they have the curriculum and everything, but it seems good. But, and as I've researched, there's more and more options like that, like co-ops, and I think you'll talk about that a little bit, where you teach together. So it's really increasingly rare that you'll have a homeschooler who stays at home all day with her kids and teaches them. There's usually some supplement that is happening. And so people are like, what about social? they're getting social. They're getting smaller groups of social, which in a lot of ways is actually better than large groups. You actually get, you don't go into cliques and things like that as readily. So I've been pleased with, and also if you just go online, you can buy curriculums and they make it easy, but you have to just decide what's best for you. So it's kind of overwhelming because there's actually so much choice. You have to be willing to kind of dig through that. But yeah, Erin, I just want to end by asking how you have developed a community around you. How have you used your talents, and other women have used their talents to help each other? And what do you say to women who say, I just don't know if this is possible in my life situation?
Okay. Well, there's the personal decision of that, which is it financially feasible for your family to have one adult basically not working? Those are, and honestly, if it makes you crazy and it makes you hate your kids, then don't do it. Like there's things that you need to know about yourself and about your resources, and that I cannot advise people on. They have to just look for themselves. But in terms of curriculum, he said, it's very overwhelming. I actually think it's harder because there's so much, exactly like you said, than because there's too little. So the best thing to do, in my opinion, is just what I did. We had two parents. My husband did not want to homeschool. He wanted to put the kids in public because he felt socialization was very important. And so it meant a lot to me to provide a social setting for our kids that was consistent, that basically satisfied that requirement. I also find it funny because I think homeschool kids are really well socialized. I think the stigma is from a generation ago where people were really isolated in their homeschool families. And now, so what I did was I joined a co-op, which there's co-ops everywhere here. There's no requirement by the state to do testing or anything like that. So it's very easy to switch from public schooling to homeschooling. There's not paperwork or rules or things like that, which I'm not saying that's necessarily good, but it is very easy to transition. What we're missing here is those hybrid things. I think they're coming. More and more charter schools are taking on like the classical model, or the university model, like you suggest. That sounds wonderful to me. Usually whenever we talk about our ideal in our homeschool co-op, it's a 2-day a week with 3 days at home. It's enough to fill in even like the gaps of like questions and things that come up in your learning, as well as fit in some extracurriculars and a lot of social time. I also think it's really important that kids socialize above their age, below their age, and with adults. And so for me, the public school was never going to provide that type of setting where you're really just with your peers, your age group, and the comparison there is always to that group. And so you're always going to be most comfortable communicating to that group. Whereas, I don't know, I mean, we just took our kids out a lot and like traveled and took them out to the store, and they just talked to people. And so we just encouraged them to do so. And then we would instruct them and say, we're going into a restaurant, let's practice these social skills. We're going to the grocery store, let's practice these social skills. And I haven't ever felt that my kids had a deficit of any type of socialization. We also have a church community, obviously, and they can see this overlap between the children in their co-op, the children in their church. So they see them twice a week at least. And then there's a whole other contingent of children in the co-op who are not in that group. So it's, let's say, 20 to 30 families that aren't necessarily our best friends, but we have come together with some consistency to agree on a curriculum.
So you have a curriculum, and do you teach part of it, or how does that work? Okay.
So the way our co-op works, it's based on a Catholic classical model. And a lot of it for children is just, the idea is that you're scaffolding learning. And so even though they don't necessarily understand what they're memorizing, they are memorizing a lot of basic skills like mathematical concepts, a few things in Latin, some historical features like a timeline of history. And there's a lot of programs that are similar. And I'm not saying this is the best one. This is just the one we've chosen because we knew people in it. And it's honestly easier to start with something and then step out. So I want to say, start with a co-op of people, especially parents who have some experience. Use that as your base to explore from. So get with a structure, and then you can decide if the structure works or doesn't work, or you can supplement with something you think works better for your kids. But having that co-op from the beginning really satisfied like my husband's concerns about how are you going to do this all by yourself, and who are our kids going to know. It's like, look, we're in a co-op, and here's your friend who's also a public school teacher, and his wife left public school to like run this co-op. And just a lot of moms who were farther down the line than I was. So I could go there, ask a bunch of questions, just have social time with other moms, and have, so the learning in the way our system is the learning is introduced that one day a week, and then I reinforce the learning. And so the thing about that is that it's science and history and Latin, and so there is some mathematics, but it's a lot of the memorizing of like the times tables and some arithmetic like laws. But math and reading are dealt with at home, so they're not taught to children in age groups. I do that entirely at like on a one-on-one basis with my children. There's no stigma, and that's sort of the reason is they're avoiding the reading stigma and the math stigma. So you just do your curriculum that you choose in your home with that child. So my kids have different for that.
That was a concern for me with math, because I want, like, there's certain subjects that I'm like, I don't want them to get too far behind if I can, if they want to go back into public school. And so I was happy to see like you can go online and buy curriculums that are on level that you can do at a pace with your kids. Because it's just, you know, it is complicated for people. We have to just be willing to say, oh, I'm going to do this little piece here that works, this piece here, just be adaptable, and see, you know, what is working with your kids. So
outlook in terms of the education that we might want to provide for our children. Like I feel strongly that academics are they're non-negotiable, and that personally, I feel like home skills and virtues are also non-negotiable. But families, homeschool families, are the most diverse group of people I think I've ever seen. So anything from child-led learning to like just completely outdoor forest school to like super hippie, like unschooling where their child is really just allowed to do whatever they want. And then some parents care about standards and some parents don't. So it's a big, big group of people.
You can see why the government wouldn't like Let's remember our education in the past when we were kids and how much of it we remember. And then consider how important it is to do all 8 subjects a day. Like, we need to raise curious children. I hope homeschooling will help us. Sometimes I think good teachers in public school, but that's what we want is curious children, because so much, unfortunately, our memories don't hold on to a lot of things. And so the facts aren't as important as the ability of the child to desire to learn. And so anyway, we could talk for hours, but I hope that this was helpful to some of you. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and shoot us an email and put it in the comments. Erin is gonna also, I'll put in the show notes a article she's writing with more details on the history of kind of public school and some of the reasons she left that will go in more depth on this. But Erin, thank you so much for talking to us, and maybe we can do this again soon.
I would love to. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay, bye.